Despite the insane amount of hate Apple got when they released iOS 7 in 2013, they would go on to influence the entire next decade of design, with literally every single industry rebranding from 3D designs to flat ones. Flat design was incredibly refreshing and unique, until everyone copied it. It started to lose its personality, and Apple realized that. So in 2025, Apple announced the complete redesign of all of their operating systems. You might not think that this is a big deal or that it's just a visual refresh, but this could mark the death of flat design and completely change the course of design history by reviving 3D. Design is arguably one of the most important aspects of a brand. The feeling you get from this to this, this to this, or this to this is completely different. While a lot of people have already criticized Apple's liquid glass, saying its transparent design is unlike Apple, that's simply not true. Not only has Apple made transparent products like their iconic 1998 iMac, they started to make their software translucent with Mac OS X.
And we call that new user interface Aqua because it's liquid. One of the design goals was when you saw it, you wanted to lick it. You know, when you design a new user interface, you have to start off saying, what are the simplest elements in it? What does a button look like? And you spend months working on a button. These three buttons look like a traffic signal, don't they? Red means close the window, yellow means minimize the window, and green means maximize the window. Pretty simple.
In addition to making the look glassy with a liquidy glare, Form had function that mimicked very closely to real-life elements, also popularly known as skeuomorphism. This would help consumers feel familiar with how to interact with macOS, since elements on the screen closely resembled things in real life. Scott Forstall, the one that would design iOS 6 in the iPhone, really honed in on this style. Everything would have this bubbly look as if it was popping out. Textures were added now not just to look but almost feel 3D despite being on a 2D screen. The Notes app looked and felt like a notepad. Keep in mind, this was when the smartphone was just being introduced, so not everyone was familiar with how to use these devices. So Apple tried to make it as easy as possible to figure out how to navigate by using things people were already familiar with. They made things similar enough to the real world that you could psychologically recognize how to interact with it, but practical enough where it took advantage of not actually being real. There was balance. It was also their way of turning analog things digital. If you didn't have a physical calendar, it was okay because you had a mini one on your iPhone. This close resemblance really made your iPhone seem like a Swiss Army knife of tools where the design complemented its function. Shortly after, we saw this design across tons of operating systems. The Wii, Nintendo DS, Samsung, everything was wet. And then it all changed in 2012 after Forstall got fired by mishandling Apple Maps. So in 2013, Jony Ive took over iOS and took a completely different route. He believed skeuomorphism was limiting to the confines of the physical world. This was true to a certain extent, as some elements couldn't resemble things in the real world because it didn't exist, like the App Store. While Forstall saw iOS 6 as bubbly, Ive saw it as bulky and decided to radically transform iOS 7.
True simplicity is derived from so much more than just the absence of clutter and ornamentation. It's about bringing order to complexity.
iOS was dramatically more simple, minimal, and had much less texture. It was flat, and most people weren't feeling it at its initial release. The design of iOS 7 is simply confusing. First reaction, everything about iOS 7 feels wrong. The typeface is so hard to read, controls are totally inconsistent, and it's flatly ugly. An interesting observation, designers who have actually done any mobile OS design work really seem to dislike iOS 7. Am I alone in thinking the iOS 7 home screen icons look ugly, poorly balanced, and of an unattractive color palette? By this time, Apple had built its iconic design elements and cult fan base, so this massive complete redesign was wildly polarizing. Some felt it was cleaner and therefore easier to understand. Apple's hardware was always minimal, so why shouldn't their software be? Others felt that the colors were oversaturated and that the parallax effect just made them dizzy. Without the depth of the bubbliness, it was harder to distinguish what was a button and what wasn't. But regardless, it was a massive moment in the culture. Literally chaos at my school when iOS 7 came out, and now our Wi-Fi is down. So why did they go for such a drastic change?
Apple's big bet with iOS 7 is that you already know how to use a smartphone. You instinctively reach to the top left corner to go back, and you know to swipe from left to right to unlock your phone. Once you figure it all out, it works basically like it always has, and it's definitely cleaner and nicer, but iOS just doesn't feel obvious anymore.
Until people did start to realize that they already knew how to use their phones, and some of the new simple features were really useful and became fundamental. Everyone got used to iOS 7's look and embraced all of its design because of its functionality. As more and more people got their hands on iPhones, more people were familiar with Apple's design language. And at this time, the iPhone started booming. So despite getting rid of some visual cues and words, users could still recognize what an icon's function was just by itself. Not only that, since iOS didn't have to adjust to any crazy shadows to its environment or textures, and because it was such a simple design, it could exist in any kind of medium. You didn't need depth or sometimes even color. It became iconic and it was massively successful as an operating system. It was deemed as modern, so much so that the old iOS 6 design quickly started to look and feel outdated, in which there was a cascading effect in the entire industry where everyone and their mamas was going flat. We would see this trend for the next decade. Skeuomorphism? Out the window. But with everyone going flat, everyone started to blend in. Goodness, logos were looking boring. Shoot, I mean, like, it was even hard to distinguish completely different brands. And with everything on the same 2D flat plane, while it did look clean, sometimes it genuinely would help if there was a shadow to differentiate overlapping elements. And flat design also wasn't on brand with so many companies. Apple had always been about simplicity and looking bare bones, so it made sense for them. But riddle me this, a restaurant you could instantly know by the sign that looks straight from Italy with authentic Italian food now just looks like how it really tastes. Americanized. Okay, actually in that sense, maybe the logo design really kind of makes sense, but come on now, it looks straight out of Canva. Or like this movie franchise that could build entire universes through movie. What is this? For all we know, that could be Victor Wembanyama's logo. Brands started dropping all gradients and even color in general too. Wow, I mean, are these luxury brands or different fonts? I don't know. Even with food, this gives flavor blasted vibes. This gives some flavor vibes. Straight from a tropical forest to clinical medicine vibes. For several brands, what you saw didn't match what you got. Or with what you saw, you didn't know what you were getting. Like when I see this, I fall asleep. The logo tells me nothing. It's weird because as design editing softwares evolved, less of it was used for logos. Just the bare bones of logos were enough. Things became iconic and instantly recognizable despite its stock-esque simple design, but they also lost personality. Nothing was popping, literally. And the same was the case for software. After iOS 7 came out, Android 5.0 Lollipop came out, which was their version of flat. And I'm not gonna lie, it was straight fire and a generational update. It was beautiful, but also low-key perfect because they modeled it around paper on top of paper, giving just enough shadows to see the layers, otherwise known as neumorphism. But now it's become even more flat. On the other hand, Samsung stuck with a lot of depth in some ways and went flat in others. Honestly, a lot of in between for a while, but by the 2020s decade, mainstream software systems have all become flat, all on the same plane. Where's the character? In which we may be at a massive turning point. Combining both elements from flat design and skeuomorphism, in 2025, Apple announced Liquid Glass, their first redesign since 2013, which brings 3D glass-like elements to every single operating system they have. As elements would pass by the glass, they would use real-time rendering to bend the light in a really visually appealing and advanced way that would make it look like glass in a way that we've never. It was really impressive, as you could see the attention to detail they had to refining older versions of this, but the public wasn't as ecstatic. iOS 26 is terrible. Liquid Why Apple's liquid glass design is a step backward for UX. Some had visual aesthetic qualms about it, but the main concern was that there was an illusion of depth, but a loss of clarity because of the lack of contrast. Since it's transparent, what's behind it would determine how things look, and there seem to be plenty of cases where it looked particularly hard to read certain text, especially for visually impaired. There were also concerns with battery for the constant processing the phone would have to do to refract the light. So a lot of people were hating. Sound familiar? The reception to liquid glass has been very similar to iOS 7, and we may very well just be witnessing history repeat itself. You might be thinking, oh, Apple just spent all this time to mask their AI disaster, or how did Apple spend all this time developing just a skin? But it's likely a lot deeper, as they are psychologically previewing and preparing you for what's to come in the technological future. While the core of iOS, in my opinion, still looks nearly identical, the medium at which your brain processes liquid glass is actually different. As the tech industry moves towards augmented reality, there's going to be more and more coexistence of virtual 3D elements and real physical ones. Apple may be getting us used to transparency to prepare us for see-through screens. You can clearly see the influence of Apple's Vision OS as the shadows make the windows feel like the elements are really there in the real world. This is so that the virtual content overlaid into the physical reality feels as natural and cohesive as possible for a smooth user experience. If you've seen older versions of augmented reality, because there aren't adaptations from the virtual elements, it clearly looks like you're in a virtual environment trying to exist in a real one. There's a disconnect. Light refractions and shadows help blend them into a seamless experience. It's also why we're slowly starting to see a lot more gradients. Because of light, nothing in the world is just one color, rather several different shades of different colors. With AI on the rise, the endless colors of gradients parallels well with AI's endless and nuanced abilities. But the bigger question is, with Apple essentially now dominating America to a much greater degree compared to 2013, will this design have cascading effects on the industry outside of tech like it did before? Can this make 3D logos and design really come back? I actually hope that companies start to move back towards 3D, as it just has a lot more character. But what do y'all think? Could this be Apple's comeback? What are the current most boringest logos? What do you think about how liquid glass looks? Let me know in the comments. Peace!